councillor in Manchester and an elected member on the Labour Party National Executive Committee and the National Chair of Jammu Kashmir Self-Determination Movement, chaired by Raja Najabat Hussain. I will be chairing today's panel, discussion on human rights violations and demographic re-engineering by the Indian government in occupied Jammu and Kashmir. The people of Jammu and Kashmir have been living with widespread and systematic human rights violations by the Indian Army for over 7 decades. This has been recorded in many reports, most recently highlighted in reports by the UN Office of the High Commission in 2018 and 2019. These reports address the Indian government's brutalization of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. It is important to reflect that every siege, massacre, genocide in our world has been built on a failure to challenge these behaviors, failures which have led this hatred, evil to progress. The dehumanization of the people of Jammu and Kashmir is very significant. The perceived humanity of the Kashmiris is being erased. It becomes simpler to carry out atrocities as you no longer believe the persecuted group to be fully human. Indian politicians have been called out for stating that in regards to human rights and equality, people of the Muslim faith are not classed as equals in regards to humanity. This sickening language and behavior was condemned during and after the Second World War, when people of the Jewish faith were persecuted. The world stood up and said, never again, not in my name. It is soul destroying to see that in this day and age, in the 21st century, the persecution and oppression of people still persists. Shame on those oppressors and leaders who create mischief, destruction, distrust, and promote hate in our world. Today, we have an amazing panel of speakers with vast knowledge and experience. They have been raising their voice for the oppressed and persecuted in our world at a local, national, and international level. We will divide our discussion today into 2 parts, in which we will initially listen to our panelists' presentation. Then our panel members will share their views on how we can further highlight the issues of Jammu and Kashmir with some practical steps towards resolution. We also have a global audience following this event, so welcome, and we will try to include some questions in them from them. I would like to introduce our first panelist, Sadar Masood Khan, President of Azad Jammu and Kashmir. He's currently serving as the President for Azad Jammu and Kashmir since 2016. And before becoming the president, he was the Director General of the Institute of Strategic Studies, Islamabad. Sadar Masood Khan also has a long diplomatic career with the Foreign Service of Pakistan, where he served as a spokesman of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Pakistan's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva and Switzerland. Sadar Masood Saab, welcome.
Yasmin Dar, for you.
I'd like to invite.
Shall I start speaking? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yes. Can I start my remarks? I can?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so I was saying, Yasmin Dar, thank you so much for a very, very strong introduction and some compelling points that you have made. I want to thank Mr. Wajid Khan, former MEP, Mr. Benion. It's a pleasure to see him on the screen. John Howard, have I pronounced his last name correctly? And then Mr. Shafak Mohammed. So it's a pleasure to see you on the screen. And you've all been campaigners for the right to self-determination of the people of Jammu and Kashmir and an end to human rights violations. You have chosen your theme for today's discussion very carefully. Let me first thank, on behalf of the people of Jammu and Kashmir and on behalf of the people of Pakistan, the efforts that the European Parliament has made in the recent past to highlight the plight of the Kashmiris and to seek justice for them. In particular, I'd mention that this year, for instance, some 626 MEPs had tabled half a dozen resolutions in the European Parliament. And they had made 2 points, two very clear points. The first was that Indian legislation against Muslims, Muslims in India, was discriminatory, and that this would create the biggest statelessness crisis in the world. And the second point was that they condemned and called out India for its crackdown or blockades in Kashmir, the siege of the people of Jammu and Kashmir, and urged the Indian government to respect the right to self-determination of the people of Jammu and Kashmir and prepare an environment for ascertaining the wishes of the Kashmiri people. This was a strong voice coming from one of the strongest parliaments of the world, and it is a transnational, international parliament. It's not just one country speaking, it's the entire Europe speaking out and speaking up for the people of Jammu and Kashmir. And then I think that there were half a dozen European parliamentarians who wrote to the President of the European Commission and again reiterated their strong message to the international community and to the Indian government that they must stop their repression in Kashmir. So you would also recall that last year, Mr. Wajid Khan was instrumental in organizing a hearing in the Human Rights Subcommittee of the European Parliament, and there was Christine Chung, who had come all the way from Geneva to give a testimony about the 2 reports that had been released by the High Commissioner for Human Rights on the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. And this was probably the first ever meeting of the Human Rights Subcommittee on Kashmir in such a formal setting. Of course, I mean, previously there used to be informal discussions or discussions on the sidelines or references here and there. And I remember also that last year the European Parliament had held a plenary. This was also unprecedented. I think that this plenary took place after a gap of 10 years or 11 years. And so the European Parliament has been active. One thing that has been, one apprehension that has been expressed time and again is that with the departure of the British MAPs, there would be a huge deficit for the advocacy of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. But I'm sure that you have a network of friends in the European Parliament from France and Germany and Spain and other parts of Europe, and you have passed on the baton to them, and now they are the advocates of the people of Jammu and Kashmir and the right to self-determination for the people of Jammu and Kashmir. 2 themes that you have raised today. One is human rights violations in Jammu and Kashmir, and the second is demographic re-engineering. Now, let me briefly touch on these 2 points. First, I would say that when we say human rights violations in Jammu and Kashmir, it sounds like a euphemism. It's a soft term because human rights violations take place all over the world, in many parts of the world, the developed countries and the developing countries in particular, where people are struggling with not just rights, promotion, and protection, but also poverty and social inequality and so on. So the international audience tend to confuse the situation in Kashmir with the human rights challenges in other parts of the world. But to tell you the truth, the human rights situation in Kashmir is dire. It's a war that takes place on the streets of Kashmir every day. You cannot call it human rights violations. Human rights, respect of human rights is for civilized people. There are 900,000 troops there who are brutalizing the people of Jammu and Kashmir. Day in and day out, people are not safe in their state, in their homeland. People are not safe in their homes and streets. And no place is safe for them. Women are objectified and molested and raped, and this is used as an instrument of war. Young men are hunted down and killed. like cattle, mercilessly. So this is what is happening there. Their killings, their blindings, their enforced disappearances. People are picked up, incarcerated, tortured, and then you do not know what's happening to them. And this is being done under these lawless laws called the PSA, the Public Safety Act, and Armed Forces Special Powers Act. So these soldiers there are gods. They take these decisions about the life and death of people, and they have these arbitrary powers, and there is this rampant rule of impunity that you observe in Jammu and Kashmir. So there's a human rights crisis in Kashmir like you have nowhere else in the world. This has to be understood. So, and I'm really disappointed that the United Nations, whose charter calls for the protection of human rights, is silent, is tight-lipped, is influenced by expediency and issues anodyne statements, anodyne, ambiguous and ambivalent statements. Nobody can make out what they're trying to say. They're not siding with the victims of such cruelties and barbarities. So, and in fact, the most powerful nations, the veto-wielding powers, are appeasing India because they have other considerations, economic and strategic considerations vis-a-vis India. And this is complicating the situation. Let me touch on the second point, and then I'll come to the operative part. The second point is demographic engineering in the occupied territory. The Indian occupation forces took over Kashmir on this very day in 1947, on October the 27th, and since then they have brutalized the people of Jammu and Kashmir, and there have been massacres and genocide there in the occupied territory. The first genocide took place in November 1947. 250,000 people were killed because they were Muslims. They wanted to reduce the population of Muslims there, and they eliminated 250,000 just 1 month. And this massacre was carried out by the Indian National Army, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh operatives, and the Dogra army of the Maharaja. And that killing spree continues up to this day. Now, India used brute force. They used economic blandishments and inducements. They enlisted the support of loyalists. They created these artificial parties who were siding with India. And finally, they projected Kashmiris as militants and terrorists and said that Pakistan was sponsoring terrorism and so on. Nothing has worked for them. I mean, the biggest disappointment for India is that nothing has worked for them. So what they did, they decided last year, and they are implementing the decision this year, that change the nation, change the people, change the demography. If Muslims outnumber other minorities, import and transfer Hindu population from all over India and implant them in Kashmir, issue these domicile certificates according to the latest figures that I have, and these are 1 month old figures. They've already issued these domicile certificates to outsiders, to non-native Kashmiris, and their number is about 1.9 million. It's a big number, and the total population of Kashmir is 14 million. So what the Indian occupiers intend to do is to increase this number to 5 to 6 million, so that they would alter the demography and they would reduce the Muslim majority to a minority. They have also started what is called settler colonialism, because they induct these people, and the armed forces which are occupying the territory, they can declare any part of Kashmir as strategic and start illegal settlements there. They are also gerrymandering, which means that they are realigning and districting these electoral constituencies so that they can decrease the representation of Muslims in an assembly, although all the decisions which were taken last year were taken without the consent of the people. The assembly was dissolved, and the people of Kashmir have not been taken into confidence about their fate. In fact, there are two outsiders. One is Mr. Subramaniam, who is the chief secretary, and there's a lieutenant governor, whose name is Masood. Outsiders, they are taking decisions about the people of Jammu and Kashmir on behalf of Delhi. Delhi's writ governs the territory, not the people of Jammu and Kashmir. So any semblance or pretense of autonomy that was given to Kashmir has been done away with. Now, I would say, what is it that, I mean, this outrage is taking place. The world is silent. We're grateful to the European Parliament, as I said, and the mainstream international media, because last year they really sided with the people of Jammu and Kashmir and castigated India for its outrageous behavior. But India gets scot-free. It has not been held accountable. If there were rulers or autocrats of smaller countries in Africa or other parts of the world, they would have been dragged to The Hague. Special tribunals would have been established. But nothing of the sort has happened, and India is promoting lawlessness in the world and is undermining democracy or the international order that was put together after the Second World War. Now, here are my operative points. I'm convinced, as a Kashmiri and as a Pakistani, that you cannot put pressure on the Security Council until you turn the Kashmir movement into an international movement, and you make it a people's movement. You make it a civil rights movement, like the civil rights movement of the United States, or anti-Vietnam War movement in the 1960s, or anti-apartheid movement. If we do not have that kind of pressure from the squares and streets of London and Brussels and New York and Kuala Lumpur or Ankara or even the Gulf states, then the United Nations Security Council would be guided by realpolitik, not by the imperatives of justice and a democratic solution for the people of Jammu and Kashmir. This is one. Second is that we have to intensify our BDS for Kashmir, which is boycott, divestment, and sanctions regime or movement against India, because when you put guns into the hands of Indian soldiers, they're killing Kashmiris. When you strengthen them economically, they use that money to throttle the nation of Kashmir. So I think that this BDS has started in an embryonic form, at least in the digital space, and this has to take some practical shape all over the world. I would also say that we need more communication, more effective communication on the dire situation in the Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, and we need to mobilize international community. We are thankful, all these people who are participating in this seminar, including Yasmin yourself and all these big advocates and campaigners for Kashmir, for the rights of the Kashmiris. I'm grateful to you, and I'm humbled in your presence. And all I can do in my final remarks is to convey our deepest appreciation and gratitude to you for what you have been doing in very difficult circumstances. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sadar Masood Khan Saab, President of Jammu and Kashmir. Azad Kashmir. I will move on to our second speaker, our second panelist, and that is Mr. John Howarth, former MEP from the Labour Party. And John Howarth is a co-director of Politics Without Borders, a pro-EU think tank. He was Labour MEP for South East England within the Socialist and Democratic Group, and was vice chair of the delegation for relations with the countries of South Asia. John, thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin, and greetings to all. Assalamu alaikum this morning. I am still struggling with the notion of what one says at the beginning of a virtual conference like this. I guess it's I'm delighted not to be here, but you know, we will continue with this as long as indeed it's the only realistic means of coming together that we have. However difficult the lockdown has been and the circumstances of coronavirus have created in countries like the United Kingdom, we cannot imagine the difficulties that have been created in Jammu and Kashmir, where they've experienced a double lockdown and difficulties which are beyond the imagination of most residents of most Western democratic countries. And of course, this is indeed one of the problems that we have, because we've got rather a lot of history, haven't we? We've got a very long history, which involved, among other things, the sale by the East India Company, a legitimized group of commercial pirates, in effect, a Maharaja for 7.5 million rupees, which then creates the regime in the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir that eventually signed an act of accession in 1947 and begun to create the current impasse. And I guess what I'm trying to get at here is to take up a remark that Yasmin made in her introduction about genocides. Genocides, and this is going to sound a little bit strange, but I will explain what I mean. Genocides are never illegitimate. They are legitimized by acts of law, apparent acts of law, as are invasions, are legitimized by apparent acts of law. In Hungary in 1946, Erno Gero invited in the forces of the Soviet Union, so it was legitimate. It wasn't an invasion to crush a revolution, it was legitimized. The same thing happened with Gustav Husak in Czechoslovakia in 1968 and with Babrak Kemal in Afghanistan in 1980, or was it 1981? My memory is getting a little bit hazy on these things. But that same invitation on this day in 1947 by the Maharaja in Srinagar to invite in the forces of India in that act of accession has legitimized everything since. And what we see now in the revocation of special status, in the various acts to change governance in Kashmir to effectively end the state, as well as the special status, end the state of Jammu and Kashmir within Indian governance and replace it by various other mechanisms, you see the legitimization of something which has been a running soul for 70 odd years, and the legitimization of what has been devised. And I think whatever other doubts we may have had when we saw the Modi government in India's first moves in this direction, those doubts have been made very, very clear by what's happened over the last 18 months with the removal of the special status, with the intensification of the militarization of Kashmir, and with the construction of a very deliberate fake news and disinformation strategy, which has attempted to counter what, in a very clever way, the real evidence that escapes from Kashmir, eventually over mobile phones and video footage, which of course people have access to, but central to that is closing down the internet, issuing 400,000 residence permits in 1 month alone. Is an act that is clearly designed to gerrymander whether or not these people actually live in the situation, whether or not the state is actually settled, the creation of legitimate residency in the political process and the legitimization of whatever else is going on. So we need to take all of those things extremely seriously, because they will be used by a Hindu nationalist government to claim the support of the population on the ground in India. And so the international efforts that we can bring to bear on this situation will continue to be important. I don't believe that this situation is one that the British can particularly get involved to solve. But British voices are important. But what's important that I believe we do as British politicians is use the contacts and international networks that we have to bring to bear international pressure on a wider basis. Because the resolution of this problem without the involvement of large international blocs like the European Union, like the United States, like China, is almost inconceivable. Primary in that objective must be the preservation of peace in the region, because without peace, nobody moves forward. But also, if we can possibly create a situation where there is a settlement that, at least in the short term, creates a peaceful situation, and that means genuine in the opening up of Jammu and Kashmir to international scrutiny, then possibly we can move forward. But while there's a situation of militarization, I don't believe we can. The great gains for the people of the region, as we've seen by replacement of war with peace anywhere in the world, are increased economic prosperity and a cultural flowering. And I look forward to the day where that can happen in Jammu and Kashmir.
Thank you, John Howard, MEP. I'm going to ask our third speaker, Mr. Wajid Khan, former member of the European Parliament. Wajid Khan is a British Labour Party politician. He served as a member of the European Parliament for the North West England European constituency from 2017 until 2019. Wajid was instrumental in securing a historic hearing on human rights abuses in Kashmir in February 2019, as Sadar Masood Khan Saab has mentioned, and that was the first for over 11 years. He currently serves as the youngest mayor of Burnley and is a co-founder of Labour Friends of Kashmir. And in March 2019, Wajid was awarded Sadar Azad, the highest civilian award for his work on human rights, in particular Kashmir. Welcome, Wajid.
Well, Assalamu alaikum, Yasmin Dar, Honourable President Sadar Masood Khan Sahib, former colleagues, MEPs, John Howarth, Shafaq Muhammad, and Phil Benion. Assalamu alaikum and peace and greetings be upon you all. Thank you for that very wonderful introduction. I kind of had to step back and think, who is this person until you mentioned me there. But I'd like to say it's an honor to be here among some fantastic colleagues. And I think just to pick up on what John Howarth was saying is, look, we as British politicians, we might not have the ultimate solution, but we can be a very, very important part of that equation. And I'll tell you, the European Parliament, the Kashmir cause has lost some strong voices cross-party. So the people you see here have been the very advocates for the human rights and against human rights abuses in Indian side of Kashmir and all parts, any part of Kashmir that's got human rights violations. We have been very strong voices. In particularly, you look at Phil Benion, he's been in and out and has been there for a number of terms and he has vast experience. And I look at the work Shafaq Muhammad did in terms of the Citizenship Amendment Act, and one of the finest speeches I ever saw, I'll be quite honest, was John Howard's speech in the plenary session when he used his 1 minute allocation to specifically talk about the human rights violations, the gross violations. I just want to say a few words and just say, look, I want to make sure that we have the hope to get this moving forward. And I think we've got a huge role to play. And as Honourable President Saab, Mr. President spoke about, is that European Parliament has strong values and historically has been a great friend of the Kashmir cause. And I salute the Honourable President because he has been able to project an advocate for, as a Kashmiri, as somebody who is a representative of Kashmir in a very intellectual, passionate and emotional way. Because it is an emotional, it's unfortunate, it's a very emotional situation there where people are getting raped, women are being raped, children are being tortured, are shot up, mass disappearances. And just look at the historical, the travesty of the Kulan Pashpara, the women that were raped there. And if you look at Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, every human rights organization has been saying for a number of years that the situation is grave. We talk about a genocide may happen, who's to say that there isn't a silent genocide happening now? We need to learn the lesson from Srebrenica. We have examples here. You look at what's happened here in Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland, historical issues have been sorted. And you look at what happened in France and Germany in terms of world wars, numerous, and the European Union came in and did its part. I have the hope that we can make this right. We can make this right because we need an international broker. We have an honest broker like Norway was coming in to look at Israel, Palestine. We need an honest international broker to come in and support this. And the issue here is really tragical, because what RSS inspired BJP thinking is that we have got to make sure that we do not make it multilateral. We do not make it bilateral. We make it unilateral. And they move from multilateral United Nations resolutions, you can ignore them. They move from bilateral 1972 Shimla Agreement, get rid of that. It comes down to the Citizenship Amendment Act. We can do what we want. Basically, we can do what we want to them people who is everyone else interfere. And that is the example that Modi is unfortunately transpiring in his country, and in particular Jammu and Kashmir. So I'll leave it there. I have hope. I have lots of hope, but I hope I can pick some things up in the questions and give other people a chance to come in.
Thanks, Wajid Khan. I'm going to bring in our fourth panel member, and that is Mr. Phil Benion, former MEP, British Liberal Democrats. Philip remained an MEP for the West Midlands and played a leading role on human rights and political settlement for occupied Jammu and Kashmir, and was an official election observer in Pakistan in 2013. He is currently an executive committee member of the global organisation Liberal International, and also sits on its Human Rights Committee. His main area of interest on this committee is democratic rights, and he has also spoken at the United Nations Human Rights Council, calling for the release of political prisoners. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you very much. Again, is that really me? Now I'm a working independent farmer here in the Midlands, because I've lost my pulpit in the European Parliament again. But I guess it was yet another democratic decision by my own electorate that decided that. That's the UK's leaving the EU. Now, I just want to deal largely with the more global aspects of the problem in Kashmir. Now, to some extent, this is, as the President has said, a different a type of problem and different issue, because it goes back to 1947. It probably even goes back further than that. It certainly goes back to the way that the British Raj was organised or not. So yes, this is a very, very long-standing problem. So you can't really say that it's part of the zeitgeist that we see in the rest of the world. But the zeitgeist that's happening in the rest of the world, which is extremely worrying, has had a big influence on this unilateralism we're now seeing from India. And the escalation from the Indian point of view, the revocation of autonomy, this is very, very much connected with what's been going on in the rest of the world. Now, I'll try and explain what I mean by that. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, the one thing that world leaders would do, they would at least give some verbal recognition of the universal values of human rights. You could never imagine, for instance, JFK being a pure transactionalist in the sense that we see Donald Trump today. And I'm afraid we have lapsed into a sort of lethargic and fatalistic view of the world, whereby even the population see, well, we can't do anything about this. Let's just get on with our own lives. And what we see is that people don't understand now why that is a very, very dangerous route to take. They do not connect human rights abuses in Kashmir with their own human rights. But this is a spreading contagion. And what we see in China, for instance, is with Xi Jinping. I mean, the repression of the Uyghurs is an even greater human rights abuse than we're seeing in Kashmir. I would say what we're seeing in Kashmir is probably on a second level to that, along with the repression of the Rohingya in Burma and the democratic repression in Cambodia. We're also seeing the environmental destruction in Brazil by another one of these transactionalist leaders that we're seeing today. Now, and it is largely our own individual complacency which has allowed things to get this far. We have to really look into the social reasons why this is happening. It's a very, very, very complex issue, but there are things that we can do, and the world is, you know, the liberal democracies, at least some of them, are starting to wake up. The pundits are starting to wake up. There was a piece in The Economist last week. There was a piece in The Economist about 3 or 4 weeks ago on Kashmir. Without a doubt, it was, and The Economist is a magazine which I certainly tend to trust its opinions. And it was absolutely on the side, coming out completely against what Modi has been doing. Now, Modi, of course, is in some respects, he's copying Xi Jinping. What China can do, if China can put minority rights aside, so can India. Whatever China can do, India can do better. And it's this, and it's the West failing to respond, which is really the most shocking thing. But whether a transactionalist in the White House, it makes it extremely difficult for others to respond. Now, we have made changes in the European Parliament. I think before we, when Shafak and I got there last year, and we were both involved in foreign affairs and human rights, we would have seen that sort of transactionalism in the fore. The very idea of sanctions against China or India would have never got off the ground. But we're actually seeing, even with the EPP and other groups that would normally take that view, we have seen some change. Now, the fact that we, in a few short months, managed to really make some movement in the European Parliament is encouraging. So we have to have hope. We also see some movements for change at the United Nations. Now, we need reform. We need the reform of the Human Rights Council. What we see in the Human Rights Council now is that the worst human rights offenders, they campaign, they get their own friends to elect them to the Human Rights Council, largely so that they can actually tick a box and say, look, our human rights can't be bad, we've just been elected to the Human Rights Council. But look what China did over the Uyghur situation. They got 50 UN member states to sign a letter of congratulation on China's human rights efforts in Xinjiang, where they're providing education for the people. I mean, this is newspeak. This is 1984, which is here, and you know, these 50 nations are also, we just elected China to the Human Rights Council, and Saudi Arabia, for God's sake. Now, and Venezuela was on there before. Now, this is a real problem. So my view would be to make the Human Rights Council something like the General Assembly. So at least they can't get any kudos from getting elected to it, and that all member states from the UN are part of the Human Rights Council, and that should be how it should be going forward. Certainly, this is something I've discussed with Hillel Neuer of Human Rights Watch. So the fact that magazines like The Economist are now, and the newspapers like the Financial Times are actually starting to put this about, that if we in the liberal democracies are not willing to stand up for our values over human rights and not willing to do something about it, then how can we expect the despots of the world to mend their ways? I mentioned the possibility of sanctions on India in my last speech in the European Parliament at the end of January. Now, a year before, that probably would have been laughed out of the House. Not now. We are actually starting to see the democracies starting to think, look, should we really be trading openly with China and letting them do everything they want? Should we really be doing the same with India when the Chinese are running basically gulags, prisoner camps in Xinjiang, where India is shutting down a whole region, what should actually not even be a region of India. You know, when these things are happening and we just say, well, you know, business as normal, we can't afford not to carry on the trade, and we make all sorts of excuses, we're not going to get them to change. We actually have to take a much tougher line. But I just see the one bit of optimism I have is I just now see that this is actually being discussed seriously amongst opinion formers, and we have to keep on driving that forward, all of us in our own small ways, and maybe in the fullness of time we'll actually get some resolution to these problems. Thanks.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you for your presentation. I know we've not stuck to time, but hey,
sorry about that.
We're talking about Kashmir, so the passions run deep. I'm going to ask our fifth panel member, Mr. Shafaq Mohammed, former MEP. Mr. Shafaq Mohammed was selected as part of the 9th parliamentary term. He remained a member of political groups, Renew Europe Group, and belonged to National Party Liberal Democrats, United Kingdom. He was also a member of Committee on Culture and Education and was part of the delegation for relations with the countries of South Asia from 2019 to 2020. He was a substitute member of the Women's Rights and Gender Equality Committee, plus a substitute member of the Human Rights Committee. Thank you, Shafaq.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to follow my good friend and colleague Phil Benion in any debate about human rights. He really is a passionate supporter and quite animated, and we do miss his passion in the chamber. Sadar Masood was quite right in the sense that with the departure of the UK MEPs, the Kashmir cause may well have suffered a setback, but I don't think it's fatal, Sadar Saab. There's plenty of good people still in the European Parliament that do care passionate about human rights and civil liberties. I can tell you that my former colleagues in the Women's Rights and Gender Equality Committee are very much engaged in protecting women's rights across the globe, and I think the issues of Kashmir should be a work programme for them to look at in terms of how women, who, in my opinion, have been the biggest victims in the Kashmir conflict for many, many years. They're the ones who lose their brothers, their sons, their husbands and their fathers, and they're the ones whose own dignity and respect is often violated, whether it's from sexual assaults or actually, as one of the speakers mentioned, around mass rapes in villages that have been well documented. Now, the issue of Kashmir can no longer, in my opinion, be a bilateral issue. We've given 48 years to see if we can resolve that. That's as long as I've been alive. And I was born in Kashmir in 1972. I think we need to look at how peace has been achieved elsewhere in the world. And, you know, we've got an example on our doorstep, which is Northern Ireland. We allowed that to continue the troubles for 30, 40 years. And ultimately, it took outside intervention to bring different opinions together. And what we've seen is that the boundaries that used to exist, the army checkpoints are gone. The two different communities are able to meet and greet each other and work alongside each other. And actually, we've seen a peace dividend. So we do have an example that we can take forward. And we have to continue to pressure, whether it's local governments in your home countries, the United Kingdom, or actually the EU, because we still have a foothold in there. You know, the fact that we're talking here now from different parts of the United Kingdom, and Sadar Sahab from Pakistan, Kashmir, is the fact that we can also engage with our former European colleagues to ensure that they continue to fight for this issue. And I think the more spotlight we put onto India and actually show how India has changed. India before used to have this very romantic perception, image of the Taj Mahal, the Goa, the Red Fort in Delhi. But actually, Bill's right, in the last year or two, we've been able to actually expose India in terms of the more negative side of it. The fact that the human rights violations in Kashmir, the continued lockdown, the imprisonment without charge for a year, by and large, for most of its political leadership, including the ones that used to be their biggest cheerleaders, the people that were in government with them for a while. And I think the issues around the Citizens Amendment Act have also opened it up to say, actually, it's not just Kashmir where this problem exists. This problem also exists elsewhere. And actually, we need to work with voices within India. And we should not be put off by the fact that there are some vocal opponents of ours in our home countries that will continue to whisper in our political leaders' ears, saying, if you talk about India, you'll upset the Indian population here. I tell you who will upset. We'll upset the BJP right-wing activists that reside in our country. Most decent Indians are not BJP members or supporters, and we need to be aware of that. So whenever we get those challenges, and we'll get them in our respective political parties where people want India and Kashmir to be a no-go area, we cannot allow that. Because at the moment, the people of Kashmir, in Indian administrated Kashmir, don't really have a voice. Internet connections are down. The political leaders have been locked up. Some have been released recently, but they are talk now that, they're going to try to impose other leaders there instead. So the challenges are hard. And all I'll say in the final point to Sadar Masood Sahib is, nice to see you, sir. And I want you to be able to really provide the alternative to what exists in India. So where India doesn't allow people like Phil Benion or John Haworth to visit, I would say open the gates up for anyone from UK Parliament, UK councils, EU Parliament, EU kind of mayors, etc. Anyone who wants to visit Kashmir should do and can do, whether it's an official tour organised by the President or the Prime Minister of Azad Kashmir, or informal, i.e. someone like me taking my friends to go and see Kashmir without it being a formal event. So people can actually go and see whether there are 500,000 Pakistani soldiers at every corner in the street. Because when they look at Kashmir, they think that's what the reality is across Kashmir. And I've had to tell my friends, look, yes, there may all be soldiers, but they're not the line of control. They're not on the streets and bazaars. So we've got to really show this contrast between what exists in Azad Kashmir and what exists in the bit that India administers, and compare the issues there, the freedom of movement, the freedom for expression that exists. Clearly, there will always be some issues in any country. We'll have them in our country. But I think there's a real opportunity there, Sadar Sahib, for you to show the alternatives, to say, this is what exists here. Now try going across the border there and see whether you can, how far you get from Delhi. Time's pressing, Jasmine, so I'm going to call it a day there. And no doubt there might be one or two questions that you might want to pose to myself or Sadar Sahib or anybody else. Okay? And nice to see you all guys again. Thank you.
Thank you, Shafaq Sahib. We have run over, but we have enough time, don't worry. The second part of this webinar, we're going to sort of focus on, I'm trying to get some of your ideas and views in regards to how can we further highlight the issue of Jammu and Kashmir, and maybe any sort of ideas or any practical steps for the resolution. So please, I'll go to Sardar Masood Khan Sahib.
Well, thank you so much. I think this discussion has been very enriching, and I have learned new dimensions of international diplomacy, how we should go about projecting the issue of Jammu and Kashmir and seeking the international community's support and solidarity. One point that has been raised by Mr. Shafaq Mohammed, I want to respond to it. Fortunately, for the past 4 years, we have been welcoming delegations from the United Kingdom, the Conservative Party representatives, also the Labour Party, Lib Dems. I don't think that somebody from SNP has visited Azad Kashmir, but other parliamentary delegations either cross-party delegations or just party delegations. We've been visiting Azad Kashmir, and we've taken them around. We have shown them that there are no concertina wires there, there are no barricades there. Military personnel are not patrolling in the streets of Zotrabad or other towns or townships of the Azad territory. So, in fact, it's not just confined to the parliamentarians or politicians. We have invited academics from abroad or business delegations from the Middle East, from all over the world. And we have gone out too. I mean, Azad Kashmir, of course, we are a developing region. We have our own challenges in regard to the rule of law, governance, and also economic development. But we do not have the systemic and systematic violations of human rights that you witness in the occupied territory. I mean, ours is a peaceful region, and I have said time and again that we have lots to showcase and little to hide. We also want to develop Azad Kashmir as an economic hub, and therefore we want to give as much exposure to the international community as possible so that they can come and invest in the region and also see our aspirations for freedom in a peaceful manner. So I'll stop here, and I'll be keen to listen to others, because as I said, I mean, I want to repeat those 3 points, that we have to make it an international people's movement, because I mean, I was in New York. I represented Pakistan in the United Nations Security Council for 2 years as a non-permanent member, and I know the dynamics. I mean, when the P5 make up their mind, they can meet over the weekends to take decisions about Central African Republic or South Sudan or West Africa or Mali, or name any minor or major conflict in the world, and the entire machinery of the Security Council would be mobilized. But the Security Council is hamstrung because of realpolitik, because of the zeitgeist that Mr. Phil Benion was talking about, and this culture of unilateralism that he was talking about, this culture of exceptionalism that India has espoused. I mean, we associated the culture of exceptionalism to the United States, the preeminent nation in the world, and that too was criticized in this democratic era. But India has assumed this role, or donned this role, before its time, as a matter of fact. I mean, the time for India has not come yet, and yet it seeks exceptionalism, and it practices unilateralism, and it thinks it's above the law. And this culture of impunity has to be shattered by the collective will of the people of the world, and that's why a people's movement is required. Second, a sanctions movement, a BDS movement, because India should feel that there are barriers to this kind of behavior. So, and the third is that we need to, I mean, the onus is on us, the Kashmiris, of course, and the people of Pakistan, but also on our friends and advocates all around the world to inform the world of the true situation in Kashmir and strategize together to alter the situation. I mean, we should not just complain about it and project our helplessness. We should be proactive and steer the world opinion in a direction that we make decisions and we get results. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm going to put that point to John Howarth. So how can we further highlight the issues of Kashmir and any sort of practical steps moving forward?
Well, you know, I think that the most important event for just about every serious conflict in the world that requires multilateral action will take place next Tuesday in the United States. Because while the United States remains in a mindset of isolationism, its ability on the international stage to act there's any sort of agency for change, for peace, for settlement, whatever might come out of the mouth of the current occupant of the Oval Office, is a nonsense. It's simply not going to happen. So removing Trump, which is obviously a matter for the American people, but I very much hope that they will, would not represent an automatic step forward, but it moves a big player in an important direction towards reinvigorating multilateral structures, which the proponents of national conservatism and populism have sought to pull down, whether those structures be the European Union, ironically, the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, or whatever. All of those things have been undermined by the actions of populists and national conservatives, and they need badly to be. It's quite right to suggest that this cannot be, as Shafak rightly said, anything that a bilateral approach can hope to be successful in. It needs at least to be a trilateral approach, but also realistically a multilateral approach, because something has to guarantee the involvement of the Kashmiri people in the settlement. Because not only has that been promised for 70 years, under initially in India making a promise that it would carry that out, but when it realized that it wasn't going to go their way, that rapidly fell away. But also, of course, the United Nations resolution. And I come back to that notion of the reinvigoration of multilateralism. The United Nations has structural problems of its own, but it's only one of the 5 permanent members, and preferably the most powerful of the 5 permanent members, that can take that forward. Initially, those 5 permanent members were based around roughly their nuclear power status. That does not make sense in the modern world. It is because there are many other nuclear powers. But the structure of the United Nations, as well as the United Nations, as well as being part of the solution, is as things stand, part of the problem also. So there needs to be a reuniting, reinvention there. In terms of the situation in Jammu and Kashmir itself, I think it really is key that the commitment to peace, the commitment to peaceful civil resistance is tantamount in whatever structures of opposition to the current situation are developed. And I know that's a really, really easy thing to say from a comfortable residence in Newcastle upon Tyne, in a relatively still democratic situation in the United Kingdom. But it is absolutely vital to progress, because wherever we have seen resistance that has gone in opposite directions in a situation that is similar to that in Kashmir, it has made the situation worse, not better. And the central tactic that India has used to justify its militarization has been, and of course this plays to international audiences in the West, is opposition to terrorism. And, you can turn that to whatever you want. But if you've got evidence that that's the way things are going, then it's a hell of a lot easier to do it, and other democratic governments will fall for that line. So the importance of peaceful civil resistance, not just for the maintenance of peace in the region, but for the creation of a peaceful future for those people, is absolutely. We see the Indian state altering and reforming and changing and imposing new forms of governance. I think it's also absolutely key that those forms of governments, if they're even partially democratic, are actually used as the vehicles of expressing the view of the Kashmiri people, because boycotting and abrogating democratic structures doesn't work. It doesn't produce the results that we hope it will. And again, that's an easy thing to say from Newcastle, but I will put that, I would say that there is ample evidence around the world that is the case. because it doesn't delegitimize those structures. It simply enables those structures to be used for the purpose they were conceived of. So I would say all of those things are important, but we also need to recognize and understand that every country has its own politics, and India has powerful friends. And Shafak again referred to this. We see this in the United Kingdom, where, for example, the Labour Party has significant and strong votes from all of the communities who migrated to the United Kingdom from the Indian subcontinent, and seeks to preserve good relations with all of them. We other political parties too in the United Kingdom, and that reflects itself in other places, and where it will also reflect itself. And I suggest that this is important in determining how Pakistan, how Azad Kashmir, how Jammu and Kashmir activists communicate internationally, is that will also become key in the United States, which I've been visiting for very, very many years. And every time I do, I see more and more of a diaspora from the Indian subcontinent. And that diaspora will begin to have significant relevance in American politics. So those strategies of how those communications are used in the world will be hugely important. And of course, we must continue challenging and re-articulating that universality of human rights that many of the multilateral organizations that I started by referring to are constructed upon.
Thank you, John. I am conscious of time, so we've had several questions come through. I'm going to put those questions to each one of you, and probably a very brief response. I know we've not got that much time. So I'm going to put a question. My first question I'm going to put to Phil Benion, and the question is, why is the UN and EU and other champions of human rights not alarmed at what is happening in Jammu and Kashmir? And why is the Indian government not being pressurized by the international powers by putting economic sanctions for its state terrorism? And that question was from Ali Raza from Brussels.
Yeah, well, as far as the EU is concerned, of course, again, we did start to talk about this last year. Certainly in January, it was being openly discussed in the European Parliament. One of the things that has been alluded to in the last answers from John are about the power of the Indian lobby. We have to remember that in the European Parliament, the Indian lobby was absolutely overwhelmingly active in compared with the Kashmiri lobby in getting through MEPs' doors and pushing them into making speeches in that debate. So when it came out in the debate looked as though it was actually quite fairly evenly distributed. So the Kashmiri lobby, to be able to actually to get its point across, has got to be more unified, and it's got to be better resourced and better organised. Whereas the Indian lobby emails absolutely everybody. I got a huge amount of pressure to reverse my position, which I resisted. But the Indian lobby is extremely well organised. So that's the first thing. And as far as the UN is concerned, we've talked about this. The UN has never been able to raise troops in the way that some people would like to deal with military engagement across the world. It's not what it's there for. It never has been, even back in the 1940s when this first started. So we can't expect the Security Council to do anything as drastic as that. But what we should be able to expect is the Human Rights Council to pass resolutions against India, which of course India wouldn't like. But again, the level of organisation of the India lobby is greater. The Chinese are actually, in this respect, have can make a devil's pact with India, because the Chinese, through Belt and Road, had so many developing nations under the financial cosh that they can twist their arms to vote against against any action against human rights, because basically, if we have sanctions on India on behalf of because of the Kashmiri situation, well, why shouldn't then the West have sanctions on China for the Xinjiang situation and the Hong Kong situation? So China is using its economic muscle to get developing nations to vote with it, and it's been very, very successful in that. So we have to be more organised from the view of the liberal democracies, and we have to be more ideological from the point of view of our values. If we're transactional and say, well, we're going to side with China because lots of jobs are dependent on trade with China, then we basically kowtow, and we have to change that. We have to change that view. I think we are making progress, but unless we actually get governments in the West who are willing to take courageous positions, then we're not going to make enough progress. But I'm sort of cautiously optimistic on that front. So there's a few things that have got to change. But from your point of view, the questioner, the biggest change to make is to get the Kashmiri lobby organised, rather than having. I mean, I don't know how many different organisations there are. There's tens, 20, 30, 40 organisations, very often saying different things. So being organised, being effective, being well resourced.
Thank you. Thanks, Phil. Thanks for that. I'm going to jump some of these questions. So I'm going to go to another question, but I think I'll pose that to Vaji Khan. So there has been a lockdown in Kashmir since 5th of August 2019, which is an illegal act. Is this a sick joke that in 21st century we've seen this kind of brutality and are keeping quiet? And that question was from Imran Saqib from Brussels.
Well, knowing Imran Saqib, I know he's always asking tough questions. I think he's got a very valid point. If you look what's happened since August 2019, they've been in a much stricter lockdown. For example, the lockdown that's taken prevalence all over the world, we've all suffered, and it's just a reminder of what is a lockdown. The inhibition of doing certain things, you following the guidance of the law, you've got to follow rules. And however, the lockdown nature in Jammu and Kashmir, in the Indian administered Kashmir, is of a brutal nature. You're not even now allowed to have mobile phone signal. There's a house arrest going on. It's nothing like it. My view is that's happening and the world is ignoring it. Just to add on what people have said before, the United Nations, the Security Councils have failed Kashmiris. That is a fact. They have failed them consistently. I separate the work of the Human Rights Council. I absolutely salute the work of the Christian Chung and fellow authors who have wrote that report in June 2018, followed up with another report in July 2019. And them recommendations need to be followed by all parties. And that is the point here. Somebody mentioned before, UK has a huge role. In my view, the honest fact is when we did partition, we were never really good at partitions around the world. We might have thought we did the right thing at the time, but history has shown us we caused a lot of damage. So we've got to we have a moral duty to go back and actually do whatever we can as a British government and to go in there and try to be part of the solution here, because we were part of the original problem, and that is a fact. And I look around and I think there's Labour Friends of Kashmir, which you're the vice chair of, Yasmin. There's a Conservative Friends of Kashmir. There's a Liberal Democrat Friends of Kashmir, and I recognise exactly what Phil Benion said about the Kashmiri organisations. There's very different views. A lot of it's about having dinners, having picture sessions, and uploading on social media. That isn't the nature and spirit of getting policy change within your party structures. And I think the time has come where we look to the government and ask the government who's in power, who have a Conservative Friends of Kashmir, and say, what is your honest, impartial approach to this in particular? United States of America came in as honest brokers in the Northern Ireland peace process, Good Friday Agreement, and that is what a solution is. And I think now is the time where all of us, I look around the pictures and I see some very powerful figures within the movements. You know, some of us are obviously retired, finishing off, enjoying farming life. I think there's always a role for all of us to get involved, and that's why I'm going to send out everybody an email today to see if we can get some former MEPs kind of mini informal kind of work to do wherever we can within our remits and our networks we have in the European Parliament. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Vajid. I think my next question I'm going to pose to Shafaq Mohammed Zab, and the question is, India is not allowing international media and human rights organizations to observe the real conditions of the people in the occupied Jammu and Kashmir. How long are we going to suffer like this? And this question is from Asghar Mir from the United Kingdom.
Not a moment more would be the honest answer, but the realities are that at the moment the entire world's in a lockdown, so therefore people are using the cover of COVID to actually create issues around human rights. So India may well get away with restricting the movements of journalists. You know, they've already chased out Amnesty International, which is a huge backward step for human rights, civil liberties across India. I think that's something we should all advocate for and challenge. So every time somebody says India is the biggest democracy, we'll say, yeah, the one that chased out Amnesty International. That's not what normal democracies do. You know, always been a big advocate that when it comes to human rights, no country, including our own, should ever mark its own homework. It always needs a strong press, whether it's internal or external, to also shine a spotlight on some of those more difficult issues that face that country. And obviously it needs these well-renowned NGOs to go in. So therefore, we've got to carry on challenging the Indian government. It's more difficult from outside, but that doesn't mean we can't. Because let's be honest, we are awkward. You know, earlier this year in January, what me and Phil Benion and others did when it comes to the CEA really caused problems, because it shone a spotlight onto what was happening there. And actually, it woke up a few MEPs, if I'm going to be honest, Phil, that I didn't think would. The EPP in particular found it very, very difficult. Right? They've been staunch supporters, but when the facts were produced to them, not by me, but by the research service within the Parliament itself, and that's what we've got to start to do, use more independent research channels, whether it's the parliamentary research section in the UK or the EU, to say, I'm not saying this, Yasmin Dar's not saying this, this is what, you know, professional civil service policy research officers have said, and we use that opportunity. And actually, privately, the EPP was saying that there was nothing in my resolution on CAA that they would disagree with. It was just awkward because Mr. Modi was due to come to move forward in the India trade negotiations. I'm happy for India to move on the trade negotiations because it's got to be bedded down with European values. And one was about respect for international law and its obligations, which includes United Nations resolutions, and human rights obligations, and respecting women. If they sign up for all three of those and actually put them into action, I'm happy to have any trade deal with them. And I think we should insist on that with the UK government now. I know they'll not care what we've seen in Yemen and elsewhere, just because people don't care and they try to ignore what you say. Deep down, they do care. You know, the fact that you're right, I think whoever said it, the lobby that we see from the Indian side is a lot more professional. But ultimately, when you're fighting a bad cause, it doesn't matter how good you are. They're still, you know, you can't really airbrush out the fact that they were trying to make millions of people stateless. And we've got to use examples of what Germans did in the 1930s, in the Nuremberg laws, because that's what they were akin to, what they were trying to do with the Citizen Amendment Act. It's not gone away. It's not gone away. And I think myself, John, Phil, all of us that spoke in those debates there, we still all have a duty to keep our European colleagues' feet to the fire when it comes to either the Citizen Amendment Act or actually in terms of human rights issues around Kashmir. That job for us to continue to do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Shafaq. Obviously, we've more or less run out of time. Unfortunately, there's quite a few more questions that I'm not going to be able to ask, but I'm going to round it up. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the organisers once again for absolutely fantastic speakers and arranging a fantastic webinar. So that is Kashmir Info Brussels. Thank you to them, and thank you to Avaz Multimedia Group Brussels. I'd also like to thank our fantastic panel speakers for all their contributions. I'm absolutely proud to be around leaders, politician comrades like yourselves, all of you who are watching this, who promote peace and justice. Peace, justice, democracy, and human rights should matter more to all of us. We are united as nations and as people, speaking with one voice. Every one of us here is standing in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Jammu and Kashmir. Please remember, we belong to one race, the human race. No matter what your background, your religion, your ethnicity, we all have a duty and responsibility to be the voice of the oppressed. Kashmiri lives matter, standing solidarity with our brothers and sisters. Thank you so much. God bless and take care.